Welcome everybody to this unique tour at Fort Missoula. My name is Teresa Jacobs and I'm a member of the Missoula League of Women Voters, which is co-hosting this event along with the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. Today's tour of the remnants of the World War II internment camp here at Fort Missoula is part 2 in a 3-part series that's entitled Abridging Rights of the Other: Human Repercussions of Confiscation, Separation, and Confinement. The series has been made possible in part by an opportunity grant from Humanities Montana, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So part 3 of our series is Tuesday, just in 2 days, at 7 p.m. at the Roxy Theater. And there's a little ad about that on page 2 of your program. If you didn't get a program, they're here on the front seat before we go on your tour. You can grab it. Thank you all for coming today. This is a great crowd. And, you know, we all are, some people are still arriving here, and we come in our cars and we're going to go in our cars, maybe bikes. I didn't see any bikes. But 75 years ago, there were innocent people here, where we are right now, who were not free to come and go. In 1944, the same year that the people who were confined here were released without having any charges against them, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, a position now held by Montana's Ryan Zinke, wrote this. He said, "Among the casualties of war has been America's Japanese minority. It is my hope that the wounds which it received is in the great uprooting he called the internment camp. It was his great hope that it would heal." So a big thank you to the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula for all the work they've done over the years to preserve and make this accessible to us. And standing here next to me is the Education Director, Christiana, and I can't say her last name. So the stories that are told here are part of the healing. Your being here today is part of that healing. We also want to thank MCAT. Ron is in the back recording this for the benefit of the people who could not be here today. So they made this possible through their Media Assistant Grant Program for nonprofit organizations, which is just a great service to this community. So please be mindful that Ron is going to be traveling with us as we tour the place, and give him a little space. If you don't want to be on camera, stay behind him. It's a trick. And when you do have questions, we're going to have question and answer sessions after each speaker. Please wait until the speakers are finished with their talk and they'll invite you. And then please say your questions very loud so that they won't have to be repeated by our speakers, and that it can be picked up by the audience at home. Our speakers will be talking for 15 minutes, and then you'll have questions. Our first guest speaker today is Julie Cajune. We were going to, Julie was going to speak over there in the parade grounds, but when we made the decision, it was raining. And it still could rain. So Julie's going to speak here, and I want to tell you a little bit about her. Julie drove down here today from the Flathead to be with us. She is an educator and citizen of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Much of Julie's career has been devoted to the development of culturally responsive materials for the inclusion of American Indian history in mainstream classrooms in Montana and maybe beyond. Her work has won national recognition, including the Milken National Educator Award, the Walt Brown Montana Human Rights Award, the Montana Governor's Humanities Award, and both the Distinguished Alumni and Lifetime Achievement Awards from the University of Montana Western. Please join me in welcoming Julie.
So this place that we're at, and generally Salish people refer to Missoula as WWII, and that's a place of the small bull trout. But there are so many names of our place names here, and so many people say that Missoula came from one of our place names for the Clark Fork River, which is in Missoula. Now, I don't know if that's true. You know how these urban legends start. So, but this was part of our homeland, and our oral history says that we didn't migrate from anywhere, but that we were always here. And we have dated our presence here back 10, 12,000 years. And so our story of being here is an origin story. It's not a migration story. And so before Fort Missoula was here, of course, we were here. And the 1855 Treaty of Hellgate happened at Council Groves, that where we were forced to negotiate with the U.S. government, and our homeland in the treaty was recognized at 12 million acres. It was much larger. It was over 22 million acres. But that really relates to the theme of confiscation and confinement, doesn't it, and separation. And so the theme of separation was that we were separated from places that were beloved and that were holy to us, and that we still go back and visit. So we just went to the medicine tree. People just went there to make their prayers, like our relatives have been doing for hundreds of years. And so the idea of othering and treating others who are different in such a way as the Japanese Americans were treated here, I think even more intensely than the Italian prisoners of war were, is not an old story, or not a new story. It's a very old story. And for Indian people, it started a long time ago, and actually ended up impacting us so severely with the Catholic Church. And that was the doctrine of discovery. And Pope Innocent first started writing about, was it legitimate to invade other lands of the infidels? And infidels were non-Christian people. Was that a legitimate thing to do? That speculation within the Catholic Church continued with Pope Nicholas V and Pope Alexander, 1455, and 1493 papal bulls that were kind of church edicts and statements that actually created international law, and that was called the doctrine of discovery. And that's how newcomers came to this place, and how newcomers came to be here, and how European countries came to take land from American Indian people. And so part of that was justified through the mission of the church, that they were going to create a global Christian kingdom. So the ideology of the church literally became international law. And a lot of people don't understand that. How did Europeans come here? And if you look at an old map of the United States, a historic map of maybe about 1740, you'd see on the East Coast the British claim of lands, and then in the middle you would see what France claimed, which was the Louisiana Purchase. Everybody know about that? Raise your hand. Okay, we all read about that in our history book, and most people think that we bought that land from France, but we did not. The United States did not. The United States bought the discovery right to that land. And so they said, you know, it was whoever discovered the land, you had to go there, get some people on the ground, boots on the ground, maybe build a fort or two, and then it included this large contiguous territory. So that was actually international law. There was a book written about that by a native law scholar that I know, Robert Miller, with some other scholars, that looked at how the doctrine of discovery impacted native nations here in the United States, but also indigenous people in Australia and New Zealand, where the doctrine of discovery was also applied. And so the doctrine of discovery became U.S. law in 1823 in a land dispute case. And so this individual had purchased land from a native nation, and it ended up going to court, this land dispute. It's a very famous case, part of the Marshall Trilogy, Chief Justice John Marshall, in 1823. And the United States declared that indeed the doctrine of discovery, the international legal principle of European and American colonial law, had also become the law of American state and federal governments. Now, here's a statement from the decision from Justice Marshall. The United States then have unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule, discovery, by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. This was in 1823. Now think of, do you think that the Salish people knew anything about this at that time? They hold and assert in themselves a title by which it was acquired. They maintained, as all others have maintained, that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or by conquest, and gave also a right to such a degree of sovereignty as the circumstances of the people would allow them to exercise. So, in this famous case, Justice Marshall said, yes, this is indeed the principle of American Indian law. And so if you study federal Indian law, all of it comes down to the doctrine of discovery, that was the legitimizing of the taking of lands. That ideology actually became the principle of international law and American law. Now, last year, a group of Native leaders went to the Vatican and met with the Pope. And they asked him if he would rescind those papal bulls that legitimized these historic actions. And I don't think that happened, but at least it was a conversation. The Pope gave them an audience and they had the conversation. There was also a group of nuns, I was just reading this in the Catholic Register, who also, when they learned of the doctrine of discovery, sent a letter to bishops in the Vatican saying that it should be rescinded. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation has published a book on federal Indian law, and in the beginning of the book they talk about the need to revisit that whole idea. Now, does that mean that Native people are going to get back all of their land? No, it does not, but it might mean something to the understanding of our sovereignty, that we continue to be self-governing people, that we have a land base that we choose to keep taking care of and being stewards of. And so I think it kind of connects with everything about the idea of confiscation, separation, and confinement, being separated from your homeland, being confined on the reservation. And this fort certainly tells you that people were afraid of Indians, that newcomers were afraid of Indians. And the Salish people practiced nonviolent resistance before it was popular or had become a global concept and idea. And so we practiced nonviolent resistance with the United States government and with newcomers. And so when was the fort built? Who's our historian? 1877? Was that when the fort was established? And then the city of Missoula was incorporated in 1883. Well, the 1855 Treaty of Hellgate, and I have some treaties here if anybody wants a copy. In Article 11, Victor, who was a principal chief of the Salish, in that treaty never was agreeing to move from the Bitterroot to what they called the Jocko Reservation, which is where our reservation is now. Because the Salish and Pend d'Oreille are relative tribes, but, we considered that was their, really their homeland, and we were settled in the Bitterroot. And so he never negotiated away his land. And so in order to get the signature on the treaty, Isaac Stevens agreed that there would be a survey to see if that would be suitable for the Salish people. This was in 1855. And it also said that they wouldn't allow any settling, that no settlers could go in there until this survey had been completed and until that question had been decided. But in fact, if you know local history, settlers did move in and there was pressure put on the government. James Garfield, before he was president, went there in 1872 and tried to convince, by that time it was Chief Charlo, because Victor had died, to move. And so there was a remnant people who were holding on and saying, no, this is a solemn promise and guarantee that was made to us, and we want to hold the government accountable to it. But as you know, that didn't happen, and so in 1891, the people were starving and they were surrounded. And so they were forcibly removed, and they came up to what we call the Flathead Reservation, what they called the Jocko Reservation back then. So, but when people wanted to go hunting, which is how we were living, subsistence living, you had to get a pass from the Indian agent. And so there was confinement. Confinement was very real. So I'm going to end there. It's a really short amount of time to try to say a lot. But I wanted you to understand the international principle to how the United States was colonized, because I don't think that that is told in mainstream history. So if there are any questions, I'm more willing to answer them if I can. I'm also not a law scholar, but I have worked with many Native law scholars. Yes?
Just that decision by Chief Justice Marshall sounds inconsistent with, I guess, Florida, the Seminole, Cherokees, and they won their rights, didn't they? And that's the one that Andrew Jackson ignored, and then the Trail of Tears and so on. It seems inconsistent, doesn't it?
Well, yes, it does seem inconsistent, but what Marshall had to do was decide, the decision was, can an individual buy land from an Indian tribe? So if you wanted to come up and buy some of our land, can you do that? Well, the federal government, they couldn't allow that. They said only the nation who has the discovery right, who has the right to that territorial area could buy that land. So, for instance, the Louisiana Territory purchase, nobody but France could get land from the Indians there. And so when the United States bought that, then they could go in then and enter into a treaty with tribes to try to get that. And certainly there are many inconsistencies, both in treaty law and treaty promises and obligations. Any other questions? Yes?
So, Julie, could you say a little bit about the repercussions on tribal members and how that might still be felt today? Of what happened at with the Hellgate Treaty.
Well,
the confinement and
there was immediate poverty, because if you can imagine using a territory where you had everything that you needed, where you knew where to go and get things at every time of the year, and you use those for hundreds, thousands of years, and then all of a sudden you have a limited land base. And so making a living became very hard. And so Indian people knew that they had to get into ranching and farming, which they did in earnest. And our tribal members were actually on the verge of economic self-sufficiency when Dixon pushed through the Flathead Allotment Act in 1904, and we lost over 60% of our reservation land base. Now there's another inconsistency. And so we were farming and ranching, and people used to have annual roundups because they had the whole valley floor for their horses and for their cattle, and that's when the Pablo Allard herd had to be sold, because what wasn't allotted to tribal members in 1910 was opened up to homesteaders, which they say was an abrogation of the treaty. But after the fact and after the land is sold, are we going to get it back? No, we were never given it back, even though the court of claims, and they said, yes, it was wrong. But we have been buying back land the most, since 1935. Our tribe has been buying land back, and so I think we're now at around 65%, but we were below 40, I think, at one time, after homesteaders came in. So that's why our reservation is mixed. So Indian people, at home, we are the minority population on our reservation, which is another unique thing from other reservations who didn't get opened up to homesteading.
Nice answer.
Pardon me?
That's good.
Oh, okay. Oh, I got a thumbs up. Okay. Thanks, I needed that. I didn't know if I was being irrelevant. Everybody's so quiet, so. But I want to say that this is just really timely because of what's happening in our country. And so we have to look at how people are portrayed to each other in groups of people. And certainly how Indian people were portrayed made settlers afraid. But we were also afraid. And there's a very funny story of a grandma and her granddaughter going to hunting camp. And every time they could see a white person on a horse or going by, they hid. They were terrified that they were going to be killed. So sometimes fear is going both ways. So I'm so glad. I just want to thank you for having this timely conversation about affording each other the opportunity to represent ourselves as to who we are, that dignity and integrity, and that we need to do that in the United States right now even more.
Christiana is going to lead the tour now, and we're going to head out this way, and we're going to head to the near the hospital. She's going to point out the buildings that were used during World War II, and so please, the camera will follow us, and Christiana is taking it from here on the mobile mic.
Okay, let's go out in the sun, guys.
So,
my name is Christiana, as I was introduced. My last name is Eyolfsson, in case anyone was curious what the mystery last name was. And right now we're standing in the middle of one of the parade grounds from the fort. So as Julie mentioned, the fort was established in 1877, and it extends back towards Target Range School, hence Target Range, and out basically to Reserve and South. So it's pretty extensive. Where we're standing now was the second parade grounds. So it comes with that 1910 remodel, all those beautiful red-roofed houses out there that we'll talk a little bit more about. And I just want to sort of get you to start thinking of the 1941 camp as being much bigger than just a barrack. So the reason why Fort Missoula became the site for the Alien Detention Center was there was already a lot of infrastructure that wasn't really being used to its full potential. So we have the 1910 remodel, all of Officers Row, the barracks that are now Forest Service buildings, a post hospital, which we'll visit shortly, plus a lot of things that were built during the 1930s for the Civilian Conservation Corps. So the ground was sort of set. When the Italians came, they did have to help build the barracks, and I think Bob will talk a little bit more about that when we get to the barracks themselves. But I want you to kind of envision this space. We ended up with about 1,000 Italians and 1,000 Japanese and a handful of Germans, and some Japanese, Peruvian, and South Americans, which is another story altogether. But the two Army barracks that are out there that are now Forest Service buildings, the one to the right would have housed the Italians when they first got here, and they would have constructed barbed wire fences around all of the residential areas. So you can imagine right down the middle of that street was a very tall, I think about 10-foot tall, barbed wire fence, and there were guard towers stationed to make sure that they could control movement around. We're going to walk. It'll probably end up being almost a half mile, so holler if I'm going too fast. We'll stop and talk about other significant points as we go. But I just want you guys to kind of start envisioning Border Patrol agents on horses, barbed wire fence, and they did have some movement across here, so folks that were interned or incarcerated here would have been having jobs and be able to travel a little bit around. But we'll walk and I'll point out some more buildings. Okay, some of you are probably familiar with Heritage Hall, the building we just passed. That one's from 1906. It was a post-exchange, was probably used by either the Border Patrol agents or maybe even some of the internees during this period. But where we're standing right now is the site of the Recreation Center. So if you saw the video, you may remember that we operated Fort Missoula along the lines of the Geneva Convention. So that meant that the folks that were incarcerated here had a certain level of quality of life that was expected for them. One thing they were guaranteed was some recreation space. So sometimes you'll see pictures of bands playing, or there was a judo demonstration, and that was right here in this big log cabin log facility that burned down eventually. So this would have been a space that they operated and lived in as well. We're going to walk along the sidewalk over there, and then as soon as I get to a good spot, I'll show you where the barracks were, and then I'll go on from there.
Is the golf course here?
The golf course? Bob, do you know where hey Bob, do you know where the golf course was? The river? Okay, so further that way. Okay, so we're standing just next to the post hospital, which was an important part of the infrastructure. They had to ensure that the internees had a certain level quality of medical care. This is a bit different from life at the War Relocation Authority camps, but we'll hear more about that later. To orient you to where the barracks were, if you look past that parking lot, you'll see off in the distance there's a red roofed building. That's the stables. So that big field in between was where all of the long buildings that housed most of the Japanese and Italians were. When we go into the barracks, there's a few maps that can help you orient as well. So that section of the fort would have been the area that was mostly behind barbed wire fence. Another section that was behind barbed wire fence was the post hospital. So it was mostly sections where people would be staying overnight, where their movement would be controlled. If you saw the film, you'll see some folks got to go out on the river, and sometimes they had jobs outside of town, or even just jobs on the other side of the fort working on laundry and that sort of thing. So there was some movement back and forth. Gardens as well. But wherever they were at night, they definitely were behind barbed wire fences. So if you'd like to join me, we'll walk that way and I'll show you the foundations of where the barbed wire fences were. That's kind of the closest connection we have to the barbed wire fence at this point. So we'll walk over that way. Starting right here. All right, we'll have to pretend I'm a barbed wire fence. But I'm standing, and at different times of the year it's easier to see. But there's a concrete foundation here, and if we were to walk across the other way, we'd find it on that side as well. So if we walk down that way, it'll take us into the field where there's a little base from the guard tower, so we can walk along that way. I'll just walk right on it.
It has a hole.
Yep, you can see the foundation there. I'm gonna fall over. So where I'm standing here, right here is the foundation from one of the tall guard towers. So as you might have heard in the documentary, there were some positive things about Fort Missoula, but beyond all of that, they all were still behind barbed wire fence, and they did have someone watching over them with a gun. So they were under military control, or Department of Justice control. Let's see, what else can I tell you about this? A lot of times we hear stories about the Italians being homesick and bored. We know a lot more about the Italians and what their life was like here because some of them stayed in the area. But I imagine that for the Japanese as well, they would have also experienced a lot of homesickness, and we'll probably hear a bit more about that in a little bit. While we're standing here, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them. I don't know everything, but I can always try. Karen.
Was escape a problem?
Not here. There are a couple stories of Italians that have gotten passed along about hiding in the back of a truck and being found at the train station. And the story goes that once they got caught at the train station, they begged the police officers not to take them back to the fort, because at the fort there was both the Italians and the Japanese were able to create their own self-government here. So, and most of the Italians had been on ships, so they already had the hierarchy going. So those particular Italians didn't want to come back here because they felt like it would be worse to be punished by the Italian self-government in Fort Missoula than by the actual police. As far as I know, we don't know of any stories of any Japanese folks trying to escape from here. Bob will talk a bit more about the folks that were here, but we're talking mainly average age of 60, upstanding citizens, probably not ones who would probably prefer to go through whatever they needed to do it the right way. Yeah, in the back.
Were they allowed to grow their own food?
Yeah, and they were able to dictate their own menus as well. So a lot of times we hear about the War Relocation Authority camps. They were eating quote-unquote American food and not things they would have cooked for themselves at home. But at Fort Missoula, they were able to cook their own food and grow their supplemental vegetables. In a lot of cases, they were eating higher quality food than folks in Missoula were because they weren't subject to rationing. Yeah.
Why were the Italians interned?
Oh, that is a long story, but the short answer is they were basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. So they were on ships in American territorial water, or they were working at the World's Fair, and their visas basically expired.
Oh, okay.
So there's more to that, but
Yeah, okay.
that's it. Yeah.
If any of them died, any Japanese died, where were they buried?
Oh, that is such a good question, and Teresa and I were talking about that the other day. I don't know for sure. 4 of them did die here, and I know we do have Japanese folks that are interned in the main Missoula cemetery, but but I think those ones were actually died as railroad workers earlier. So I don't know if they were shipped, back to where the camp where their families were. But that would be something that I should probably look into because I'm not sure off the top of my
I've
head.
heard that there are 400 Chinese buried in a cemetery on the north side of town, the village there.
Oh, really?
And they were moved from up by planes down here.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know about that. Okay, I have one more question. So, in the back, Elizabeth.
Yeah, where was the next closest internment camp? Like, it seems like Missoula is sort of out of the way. And
Yeah.
I'm surprised that there are so many people here. Where was the next? Where were they?
That's a good point. And in the barracks exhibit, we do have a map that I can show you. But just briefly, Hart Mountain, and Kuskia was a smaller one in Idaho, and Minidoka was in Idaho. So off the top of my head, I think those are probably geographically the closest. All of the camps were in places that were government owned or government controlled, sometimes on reservations. And so it was federal land that wasn't really being used. In theory. Okay. I'll talk when we're walking. And so we'll wander on that way. Before I forget, because it's kind of a fun story, there was a swimming pool right at that corner of the street there. So that was one of the recreation options at the time. We were chatting about that.
So are you gonna purposefully be pointing things out? Do you want to project your voice a little bit for people here?
I think for the most part, Teresa, we're just gonna walk over.
Okay.
So if you guys have little questions you want to ask me as we're walking to the barracks, feel free.
Okay.
And then we'll walk over to the barracks and we'll hear from Bob.
Okay.
Okay? Yep.
I'm going to introduce Bob, who is going to give us a 15-minute concentrated presentation. Robert M. Brown, known as also Bob. We have 2 Bobs on the speakers lineup here. He was the former director here at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, so maybe some of you have heard his name. Not to be mixed up with the other Bob Brown, the legislator, which I always thought. So Diane Sands was originally going to be a part of the lineup, and she had a funeral to attend, so she couldn't make it. So we're very grateful to Bob, and should have asked him in the first place. So Bob received his bachelor's in political science at Ursinus, he said?
Yes.
Ursinus College in Pennsylvania. He has a master's in social sciences from River College in New Hampshire, and a PhD in early American history from the University of New Hampshire in 1983. He has worked in museums in New Hampshire, Indiana, Massachusetts, and of course in Montana, where he was the director here, from 1991 through 2014. Bob led the efforts to obtain and restore this barrack, as well as the building T1, and he'll tell you more about it.
Hey, thank you. First, I'd just like to apologize for not being Diane Sands. But she would have done a far better job than I will. She was more intimately involved in a lot of this. But I'd like to start by setting the scene nationally and particularly here at Fort Missoula. It was in March of 1941 that FDR used the 1917 Espionage Act, which made it a crime to damage a ship harbored in U.S. waters, in order to seize 28 Italian ships, 2 German ships, and 35 Danish ships in American ports on the East Coast, along with 775 Italians and 100 Germans to be interned. The Danes, by the way, were allowed to stay on their ships. Now remember, we are not at war at that time. By April 12th, 1,300 Italians were in custody, including 62 World's Fair workers who had overstayed their visas, and 483 crew members from the cruise ship Catabiancomo, which was seized in the Panama Canal. But why send them to Missoula? Well, Fort Missoula has a long history dating back to 1877 involving the Nez Perce War, supervision of the local Indians, the Black Bicycle Corps, the new fort of the early 1900s, the World War I training camp, and the Civilian Conservation Corps regional headquarters. So the infrastructure was here. It was functioning. And also, Missoula is away from anything. I mean, where are they going to go? What kind of trouble could they get into? So Fort Missoula became the location of an alien detention center, and the Immigration and Naturalization Service was given Fort Missoula for 5 years. It would have become eventually the home of 1,200 Italians, 1,000 Japanese, 123 Japanese Peruvians, and 23 Germans, only temporarily. The initial Italians were held in the existing large Spanish Revival Army barracks that Christiana pointed out, but soon went to erecting temporary prefab barracks for the others. Now each barracks, and this is an example of one of them, was to hold between 40 and 60 men, with 40 square feet allowed per man. For every 10 barracks, the men would have their own mess hall, bathrooms, and showers. In the mess hall, one man for each table of 10 was assigned to serve. The washrooms were available after breakfast. Roll calls were at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Passes were available for men to visit town, accompanied by guards, of course. Additionally, because of the labor shortage in the United States, volunteer work parties were also used downtown, in the forests, and in the sugar beet fields. These were also supplied with guards. Now, internees worked in the fort for free, but received 80 cents per day for specialized work. Unlike the Italians, few of the Japanese worked outside of the camp. Well, for one thing, they were really not wanted by the local population for fear of sabotage, among other things, although eventually 60 Japanese did volunteer. So as I said, the infrastructure was already here, including warehouses for supplies and to store internees' luggages, a commissary for clothes, food, and etc., a hospital with private rooms and surgical spaces, an auditorium, a firehouse, carpentry and electrical shops, garages, a bakery, a print shop, a dentist's office, and a laundry. Now, in the camp, each man cost the United States government 49 cents a day to maintain. That's 40 cents for food, 5 for clothing, 2 for laundry, and 2 for medical. And this would be the same situation for when the Japanese get here. Now, Nick Collier, an INS officer from Texas, was appointed the first supervisor of the camp. There were 62 civilian employees and U.S. Border Patrol guards present at any given time. The fence was 10 feet tall, 5,000 feet in length, and enclosed 33 acres with 40-foot guard towers. 12 guards were on duty at any one time. This included 3 on horseback and 1 inside the fence. Now, the Italians were represented by the Italian consul out of Seattle until war with Italy was declared. Then the Spanish consulate in San Francisco represented them. The Roman Catholic diocese also looked after the men and provided them with supplies and treats. And of course, the fort was constantly monitored by the International Red Cross. The Italians and later the Japanese had their own elected governing body. The Italians had a general council of 28. They had their own mayor, police chief, parks commissioner, and security commissioner. And they were also handling their own grievances within camp. For entertainment, the men enjoyed movies, soccer, bocce, tennis, crafts, music, card and board games, writing letters, reading, smoking, and model building. But still, boredom was the name of the day, which resulted in very long lines at sick call every single morning. Now, this would also be the case for the Japanese when they arrived, although they specialized more in making stone vases and little sculptures. In the spring of 1942, the Japanese built a 9-hole golf course, the envy of many, I might say. When Jerry Mangione, a government official, came to interview the Japanese mayor, Yahi Teoka, he was told that the mayor was on vacation on the golf course. Absolutely astonished, the mayor's assistant took him to the golf course, pointed Mr. Teoka out. Mangione decided that the mayor looked so relaxed that he would come back later for an interview. But moving more towards the specific Japanese experience, anti-Japanese xenophobic feeling in the United States has an incredibly long history. It is particularly bad in California, but very prevalent all along the West Coast. It had been fed for years by publisher Hearst's warnings of the Yellow Peril. It was claimed that the Japanese birth rate was 3 times that of the European immigrants. Totally untrue. It was actually less. The agricultural yield per acre in California was under $42, but for the Japanese, it was over $141. While the Japanese only owned 1% of the land in California, that market value was over $67 million. So in response to this jealousy and to this yellow peril, immigration of the Japanese had long been hampered by various laws, quotas, gentlemen's agreements, and the 1924 Immigration Act. With increasing tensions in the Pacific, in 1936, President Roosevelt approved the surveillance of the Japanese in Hawaii, coordinated by the FBI, which created 3 categories, which were then also applied to the Japanese on the West Coast. A, the known dangerous. These are the influential men, including farmers, businessmen, fishermen, and community leaders. B, were the potentially dangerous, those likely disloyal, but not yet investigated. And C, those with pro-Japanese inclinations or engaged in unspecified propaganda activities, and members and or donors to ethnic groups. This group included Japanese language teachers, martial artists, travel agents, and newspaper editors. Then came Pearl Harbor, which many officials claimed had been aided by a non-existent 5th column, and hysteria went out of control. California's Attorney General Earl Warren, later liberal Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, even stated that because the Japanese had not yet been disloyal, proved that they couldn't be trusted. Well, the first Japanese men on the FBI's ABC list arrived at Fort Missoula on December 18th, 1941. Remember, only men were held at Fort Missoula. There were no women or children here or at the other 3 justice camps that were established. That's in Bismarck, Santa Fe, and Crystal City, Texas. That's completely unlike the 10 war relocation camps and the whole Executive Order 9066. Now, in Missoula, there wasn't a huge anti-Japanese sentiment. Some hysteria, yes, but it's interesting that the Missoulian editor, French Ferguson, on December 10th, 1941, warned his readers against succumbing to hysterical acts. He wrote, "There is no excuse for anti-Japanese hysteria in this part of the United States, far away from the scene of action, removed from any properties or positions of great military importance. There should be no threats or actual violence against harmless Japanese hereabouts. Hysteria should be avoided everywhere for that matter. The Japanese that are dangerous will be interned promptly in safety. The ordinary citizen does not need to worry about them. We are not going to win this war by losing our heads. Now, life in the camp was very different for the Japanese than the Italians. Now, the day-to-day routines were the same, but while the Italians seemed to enjoy it, calling it Bella Vista, the Japanese were perplexed as to why they were here and felt a terrible sadness, frustration, and loss of face. In camp, the Japanese and the Italians did not interact at all. The Wide World News Agency sent a reporter to the fort who wrote, "It seems to be quite a problem out here to keep the hundreds of Italians and Japanese happy at the Fort Missoula concentration camp. They're living in a place that looks like an expensive summer resort. They get 3 squares a day, and they have practically nothing to do. But they still lower at each other. The camp guards never have seen an Italian say so much as good morning to the Japanese. The internees just don't seem to grasp the kernel of the Axis philosophy. You know that the Japanese and the Italians have a lot in common and therefore should be happy as bugs in a rug when they're together." Well, you have to remember that the average age of the Japanese was about 60 versus about 20 to 30 for the Italians. They had no common interests and culturally no commonality. Additionally, the Japanese were being treated as potential traitors and appearing before panels assembled by the Department of Justice. This, while many of their sons and grandsons were enlisting and being drafted in the Army, many serving as interpreters in the Pacific and in the highly decorated 442nd Regiment in Europe. Each Japanese man had to appear before an alien enemy hearing board. Citizens from their own cities or states were chosen by the Department of Justice to serve without pay when not enough were present. Missoulians will sit in when nobody else was there. I'll leave that story for your next stop. But not surprisingly, the Japanese were described as silent and sullen. But the ultimate issue, even more vital these days, is why preserve this? It was perhaps best expressed by Harold Ickes in his Secretary of the Interior for FDR in his 1944 introduction to Ansel Adams' book about the Japanese-American internment. It has long been my belief that the greatness of America has risen in large part out of the diversity of her peoples. Before the war, peoples of Japanese ancestry were a small but valuable element in our population. Their record of law-abiding industrious citizenship was surpassed by no other group. Their contribution to the arts, agriculture, and science were indisputable evidence that the majority of them believed in America and were growing with America. As the President has stated, Americanism is a matter of the mind and heart. Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry. So it had to be preserved, so it must never happen again. And in Missoula, it fell to us, the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, to help. First, the barracks, this. Some of you may remember the attempt by the University of Montana to sell its fort land to the Development Company in 1994, which was stopped by the Save the Fort effort. The university, needing good publicity and in the process of replacing its maintenance building on the golf course, donated that shed, this barracks, to the museum. We have since developed these interpretive displays as well as using some of it, the rest of it, for storage. The museum is currently in the process of creating a foundation for a second, half-size barracks and is getting a third from the fairgrounds. And finally, just to just tell you a little bit about what's going on next door. In 2008, and I know I'm going over, just In 2008 and 9, the Forest Service wanted to sell the newly vacant building, by the way, which was used in part by the Department of Homeland Security on the top floor for purposes we don't know and we don't ask about, and the Sheriff's Office, and it was also used by the smoke jumpers. The museum was in desperate need of more storage space, and T1 had plenty. So he went into negotiations and finally obtained it for $450,000, thanks to Missoula County. As we began to explore the building, we went to the second floor, and Development Director Diane Sands and one of the county facility men pulled back some of the loose carpet. They discovered a wonderful hardwood floor and the shadow of what had been the judicial bench used by the alien enemy hearing boards. We removed 2 temporary walls installed by the Forest Service to reveal the full extent of the courtroom. And then Diane went to work obtaining funds for its restoration, especially from the National Park Service, with the results you'll soon see. Interestingly, through our research, and I'm almost done, curator at the time, Jason Bain, discovered that the building, which we had assumed dated back to the CCC period, was in fact the original 1885 post chapel. As we were installing the elevator lift, we discovered covered-over chapel windows. Jason researched and discovered that the chapel had been originally aligned with the old officers' row, and in 1935 moved 20 feet back, north, new foundation installed, and the roof listed to make room for a full second floor for use as the post headquarters. So the plans for that building at this point involve educational space, programming space, rental space, but that's up to the current museum staff. I'm done.
So we have time for 2 or 3 really short questions before we take our break and head up to the room that Bob just talked about in T1.
The ABC list, you said A, they're known to be dangerous. They're known to be dangerous by dint of their occupations?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
You have, on the sign here, it says 80% of the Latin American Japanese internees came from Peru. Do you have any idea why there were so many in Peru?
Not specifically. Peru, all of Latin America had quite a few Japanese. Even today, Peru is known for its Japanese thing. But that was, completely quasi-legal kidnapping campaign cooperated between the Peruvian government and the United States government. Peru wouldn't accept them back later, so these people became countryless because Japan wouldn't accept them. We couldn't accept them because they were alien because, well, we stole them. One more question.
Has there been any repatriation in terms of reparations?
There was an apology made in 1988. That was about it. And I will defer those kind of questions.
Some families did receive money. It was fairly small. It was in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $20,000.
Yep.
Some very small.
Very small, yeah.
We are now in the restored courtroom where the loyalty hearings were held here in Missoula. And we have 2 speakers who are going to give us some information about this and about that experience. I'm going to introduce both of them right now in the same time. They're going to speak in tandem with each other, and then we'll take questions after they're both done. So I'd like to start by introducing Bob Knight. Bob Knight received his law degree from the University of Michigan Law School in 1970 and was in private practice in real estate law in Missoula for 37 years prior to his retirement. Bob has always had a deep personal interest in Western history and in constitutional issues. His interest in the Japanese internment issue was sparked when he got to know Minoru Yasui, a prominent lawyer and Japanese-American activist whose father, Masuo Yasui, was interned at Fort Missoula in 1941. Our second speaker is Satsuki Ina, who flew in yesterday from the Bay Area around San Francisco to be with us. She is a professor emeritus in the School of Education at Cal State University, Sacramento, and she is a third-generation Japanese American born in the Tule Lake concentration camp during World War II. As a licensed psychotherapist, her clinical work has primarily focused on families struggling with legacies of racism and historical trauma. She's produced 2 documentary films that have been aired on PBS, Children of the Camps and From a Silk Cocoon. Just as a note, From a Silk Cocoon will be shown at the Roxy on Tuesday evening at 7, followed by some discussion and commentary by Dr. Ina herself. So we invite you all to join us for that. So with that, I would like to turn this program over to Bob Knight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the League of Women Voters for creating this program and the opportunity to speak to these important issues, and also to thank Fort Missoula and their personnel for their great participation both in this program and also the work they've done in preserving the historical significance of the events that occurred at this location. You've just had a presentation by Bob Brown, and I'm going to do my best not to repeat ground that he's already covered. I think one thing that I want to make clear is that the things that happened in this room affected the Japanese prisoners. To my knowledge, there was never an Italian prisoner that appeared in this room. And that's an important fact to remember. And Satsuki will speak regarding the dire consequences faced by her family when they were deprived of constitutional rights and imprisoned pursuant to the executive order issued by President Roosevelt in the spring of 1942. But what we're talking about here and in the context of this room is a very different circumstance. There were no women or children who were imprisoned at Fort Missoula. This was a Justice Department detention facility, and it was here for the purpose of the Japanese to deal with issues of loyalty for a distinct group of Japanese who were Issei, first generation, born in Japan, but living almost exclusively legally in the United States, which meant they were legal aliens. They had arrived here legally prior to July 1st, 1924. And in fact, many of these men had been here since the late 1880s or early 1900s. Bob hit on some of the historical facts that are important to bear in mind in considering this issue, and I'll expand just briefly upon this. He indicated that there was, during the early 1900s, a real rise in racial prejudice. Japanese, particularly on the West Coast, were referred to as the Yellow Peril, and much of this was engendered by an Irish immigrant who felt the same way about the Chinese and helped enact the Chinese Exclusion Act. And when they got that through, they turned on the Japanese. And in fact, what Bob said about agriculture and other things is very true. They were very productive people, and to some degree, they were the envy of others in the agricultural area. During that period of time, about 1920, we had what I call as 3 strikes and you are totally out. Number one, there was a young Japanese man from the Berkeley area that got involved in a court case to establish his right to be a U.S. citizen. And at that time, we were dealing with the vestiges of post-Civil War, and the standard for citizenship at that time was whether you were a freed black person as a result of the war, or whether you were Caucasian. And his contention was that he was Caucasian. And the Supreme Court said, no, 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 no. By Caucasian, we mean white, and you're not white. And that Supreme Court decision resulted, in fact, in a number of some Chinese, a number of Indians, India Indians, and others being deprived of citizenship that had previously been granted. But it was made very clear that if you're of Japanese ancestry, you're not white. And we affirmed that in 1922 by enacting a congressional enactment saying that Japanese are not qualified to be U.S. citizens, and we coupled that with saying, by the way, if you're not here legally by July 1, 1924, then that's the end of the ballgame. And so that was the final strike in the three strikes, you're out. So what we're dealing with here are men who had been here legally for a significant period of time in many instances, but who were prohibited from being United States citizens, albeit that their children, Nisei, second generation, and it's Ichi, it goes Japanese first and second, Ichi's first, Nisei's second. They were legal U.S. citizens. This was coupled with a convergence of war hysteria, and to some degree based upon what were viewed as aggressive acts by the Japanese. They invaded Manchuria. They made overtures about invading China, and relations, frankly, between the U.S. and Japan were kind of at an all-time low. So in 1936, Roosevelt directed that they start monitoring the Japanese Americans or Japanese in Hawaii in terms of their activities and whether, if there was a war that came about, there was any danger for their presence. In 1939, Roosevelt directed the FBI, the Office of Navy Intelligence, and the U.S. Army Military Intelligence to start compiling a list of people who were potentially dangerous aliens. And Bob talked in his talk about the ABC lists. And there were gradations to start with, A being those that were most suspect. And frankly, that was usually because you were more prominent. You were involved in more associations. You made trips to Japan, and you led your community. So that would get you on the A list pretty sure. But ultimately, they just merged all the lists. And in July of 1941, well before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Attorney had the list sent to all of the FBI offices in the United States on the West Coast and in Hawaii, with directions that upon telegraphic confirmation in the event of war, they were to arrest all the people on these lists. The triggering event, obviously, was Pearl Harbor. Within an hour of the attack, the first Japanese Issei on the list was arrested in Hawaii. By day's end, 200 had been arrested. And it quickly proceeded. Within a matter of days, they had rounded up, I think, about 1,500 in Hawaii and another 1,000 plus in the United States on the West Coast. These people were literally arrested by FBI agents at their homes or places of business or wherever they could be found. They were given the opportunity to basically take the clothes on their back and a toothbrush, and they were led away. Their families weren't told where they were going, what they had allegedly done to be arrested. They weren't told what they had allegedly done to be arrested. I think it's fair to say they had no advance warning or belief that there was any basis for being arrested. These men were uprooted, and for the Hawaiians, they went mostly to Sand Island and were imprisoned there for their loyalty hearings. Most of the people on the West Coast ended up here at Fort Missoula. And we had 300 and some that came here in about mid-December of 1942. By April of 1941, April of 1942, they had reached over 1,000. Now, what happened when the men came here? Well, in terms of the significance of constitutional issues and rights of individuals and the process, in December of 1941, the U.S. Attorney Biddle announced that there was going to be a process to determine the loyalty of these men who were charged with potentially being disloyal. He described it as not the equivalent by any means to a jury trial, but an opportunity to prove your loyalty to the United States. And they had done these investigations through the FBI. They had all been transmitted as part of the file of these enemy aliens. And you need to understand that they were legal aliens until December 7th. They were enemy aliens with the dropping of the first bomb and the declaration of war. And when they came here, they had been classified as potentially dangerous enemy aliens. So they get here, and one of the first things they do, and I'm going to use an example of one of the people that I've studied to give you some idea of what was experienced, and that is Shuichi Okamura. Picture here, and also standing in front of the Benkyoto candy factory in San Francisco in about 1906. The Benkyoto confectionery company is still in business in San Francisco due to circumstances which I will outline. He had come here in 1906, so he'd been here as a legal resident alien for some time prior to December 1941. He had a large family. He had a growing business. I think he had 5 employees. He had a farm. He was doing quite well. It appears that the only thing in his background, he belonged to some Japanese associations, but he was a prominent Japanese businessman. Why wouldn't he? He had also contributed to a society that honored an admiral who was believed to have been the major factor in success of Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. That was held against him, notwithstanding that the same admiral merited a U.S. carrier in Yokohama Harbor on a celebration for the same admiral. But for this man to be giving any money or belonging to an association was considered an improper act. So when these men got here, they were given what was called an alien enemy questionnaire. The questionnaire was 26 pages long, 111 questions to be answered under oath and completely. And it started out saying, your cooperation in giving as completely as you can the information requested in this form will assist the government in deciding upon your status as an alien enemy and determining whether you should be released, paroled, or interned. I've excerpted a few pages. I mean, it's got the standard questions about who are you and where have you been, what's your physical status. He lists his color as yellow, because I guess by then everyone understood that white was the category if you were going to be considered to be a potential citizen. He had 3 trips to Japan, not unusual for somebody that had significant family over there and the wherewithal to visit. He had been in business for 34 years with Benkyoto, and he registered it in San Francisco about 1920. He had, I think, 9 children, one of whom was deceased. All that information was required to be completed in detail. All of his associations had to be listed, which he acknowledged. He'd been involved with the Japanese Association of San Francisco and the Buddhist Church, and they even had from my perspective, the audacity to say, if you have never applied for naturalization, state the reason why. His answer, no qualification, because I am an Oriental. And that's exactly why he didn't and couldn't. And then finally, they say, why did you come to the United States? And his answer is, in order to make a permanent home in the USA. And then he signs it on January 29, 1942, before a notary under oath as to its authenticity. What happens then? Well, he's given a notice at his hearing. This is January 29th, this questionnaire is filed, and all of the men had to do this, that there'll be a hearing on February 3rd to determine whether what's going to be done with him. And so there's an expedited circumstance. He appears in this room and he says, I want my hearing in San Francisco. And there were panels that had been established, as Bob pointed out, in every judicial district, in federal judicial district. And the reason was so that they could have people that were closely associated to monitor this. He came in this room, and who's here? A former U.S. attorney from Great Falls and one man from San Francisco. And the former U.S. attorney says, don't worry, Mr. Okamura, we'll treat this just like you were here in San Francisco. Well, what was the significance of that? His bankers were in San Francisco, the people that had helped him. They would have testified as to his loyalty. And in fact, one of the reasons that this business is still in effect today is that during the course of the war, the bank took it upon themselves to preserve the integrity of the business assets and the family farm and returned them to them at the end of the war. That's different than Missoula Yasui, who lost $500,000 of orchard property and was unable to return to Hood River, Oregon, ended up going to Portland and committed suicide late in life after in 1952, when we finally allowed Japanese to become citizens, after he had taken the citizenship and taught other people, there was a complete deprivation of rights. There was no right to confront your accused. There was no bill of particulars or indictment. They never said what you were charged with doing. They never said how they came about the information. They required you to incriminate yourself by generating information that they then used in your prosecution. There was no trial, let alone speedy trial. There were no witnesses you could call. Who could you get to come between January 29th and February 3rd from San Francisco to appear here as a witness? So it was really a travesty what happened with these folks. And the important thing to remember is there was a complete deprivation of constitutional rights with men who were prominent, who never, ever were charged, any of the 2,500, with any crime whatsoever, ever. Yet this happened. They were prominent people that wanted what everyone wanted. They wanted the good life in the United States. And so those are the things that we have to remember when we confront circumstances similar to this in the future. Thank you.
Were they allowed?
I'm sorry?
Was there any legal representation?
No, in fact,
for them at all?
Missoula Yasui's, this is how I got involved with this, his son, Minoru Yasui, came here to represent his father, took the bus from Portland in February 1941, got a cab from downtown Missoula to come here, had authority to represent a number of Portland people, including his father. He had to sit here. They let him sit here while they interrogated his father. And if you saw the movie, Alien Place, Min is the one that said they interrogated him about Panama Canal and how do you prove a negative. Children's pictures, and they accused Minoru Missoula of that. So, yeah, no counsel.
Any questions at the end of both speakers? No more questions now.
Okay. Off.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm here as a representative of the Yellow Peril. My name is Satsuki Ina. I was born at the Tule Lake Segregation Center, which was the maximum security prison, where people who were recognized as disloyal because of answers to another loyalty questionnaire were segregated to in 1943. But I want to start a little bit different from my last talk and just say that there were experiences that resonate so vividly today. So early on, Japanese people were banned from coming into the United States. So there were bans. They had to register as aliens when they came into the country, and they had to show up on a regular basis to show that they had the right papers. My parents remained, although they were American citizens, they were born in San Francisco and Spokane, Washington. There was a period of time that they were undocumented. As a result of duress, they renounced their American citizenship. And although it was determined that it was unconstitutional because they were incarcerated at the time, but they lived as undocumented people from 1943 until 1957, when it was determined that their citizenship was returned and had been under duress and therefore unconstitutional. And they were held for 4.5 years. And it was an indeterminate detention. So my community today is, for so many decades, their story had been suppressed. And culturally and because of the trauma, we've been pretty quiet about what happened to us. But once 9/11 happened, and we started to hear the same kinds of voices and language and intensity that led to our incarceration, we are mobilizing nationally to speak up, to stand beside for immigration reform, to oppose the Muslim ban. We know what can happen in America, and the energy and the leadership that is emboldening people to speak about vulnerable groups in the same way they spoke about us in 1941 is happening again. And so someone, the other group said, "Wow, did you come all the way just to speak for 15 minutes?" And I said, "Yes, I'm honored to be here." And one of the big reasons for being here is because our story is important for people to understand the reality of what could happen again. At the end of 1988, when the Japanese Americans were granted reparations, a symbolic amount of $20,000 per person, because a congressional committee traveled all around the country and determined that the incarceration of 120,000 of us was a result of racism, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. And as Bob said, not one single person of Japanese ancestry was ever found to be guilty of sabotage or fifth column activity or any action against the US government. And they used the word national security risk, which we hear as a way of justifying any treatment or threat. And so when, after the war broke out and the decision by Franklin Roosevelt to sign the executive order, we know now that at the time that he signed that executive order, he had indisputable data from the Office of Naval Intelligence and the FBI that the Japanese Americans on the West Coast were not a threat. So we're talking about politics, we're talking about desire to be reelected, we're talking about economic gain for large organizations that were lobbying to benefit by getting rid of the Japanese. So national security risk led to several hundred children who were living in orphanages and foster care, who had 1/16 Japanese blood, removed from the orphanages, removed from their foster families, and put in prison. In the Manzanar Children's Village, they set up an orphanage in the Manzanar prison for these children, several hundred children. And I think Bob Brown talked about the Japanese Peruvians who were kidnapped from Peru. And the reason that happened was the U.S. government was concerned that they weren't going to have enough bodies to make a prisoner of war exchange. They were going to use many of the Japanese who had renounced their citizenship and enemy aliens for exchange, on the exchange ship, for Americans who were held in Japan during the war and to trade. And because they were afraid they weren't going to have enough bodies, they negotiated with the Peruvian government to kidnap several hundred Japanese Peruvians, brought them to the U.S. And my mother was standing, she was at the Crystal City family internment camp in Texas, and they would go and greet the new busloads of people that were arriving. And she said it was the strangest thing because they were coming off the bus and they were calling out the roll and they would say, Jose Miyamoto, Maria Miyamoto. And when they got off, they were speaking Spanish. And so what happened afterwards is that the Peruvian government didn't allow them back. Many of them were deported to Japan, where they had, many of them had never lived, and remained in the U.S. Without, stateless people. And when we received reparations, they did not qualify for reparations. So, I have to watch my time. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief kind of a chronology about what happened to my family. My parents were married in March of 1941, and 9 months later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. My mother had been a representative at the World's Fair in San Francisco, working in the Silk Pavilion there, and that's where she met my father. They're both U.S. citizens, and because of family circumstances, they had both been sent back to Japan to be cared for by their grandparents. My mother's mother died in childbirth, and my father's sister was very ill, and they were afraid they couldn't get adequate medical care in the U.S. So they were sent back. They were called kibe, which means to return back to America. So if you were kibe, you had lived in Japan, the U.S. government perceived them as particular threats, that the Issei's had planned to send their children back to become, potentially to develop their loyalty to Japan and then come back and work as spies or saboteurs. They were sent first to the Tanforan racetrack, which was a temporary detention facility. They called it an assembly center. And one of the things that we've been working on as scholars and researchers on this subject is to make sure that we're not using the euphemistic language that the government used to label our experience. They called it relocation, which is what happens when your company moves you, evacuation, which is when the government rescues you when there's a flood or a hurricane, and they called them, so they were called relocation centers. They were called assembly centers. People were told that we were transferred, but we were arrested and imprisoned. There's no doubt about it. We did not have our freedom of choice and action. So in the Tanforan Assembly Center, which was a racetrack, they had to quickly mobilize these county fairgrounds where they could put lots of people. And my mother was pregnant at the time and suffered from morning sickness, and she talked about these stables that they had quickly whitewashed, but there was still manure on the ground, and they were given straw to stuff into these bags to use for their mattresses. And I've been interviewing a lot of these former internees, and one guy said that he was drafted out of camp and sent to fight in Europe, and he recognized these bags that had been dropped off by the army to stuff with the straw at the assembly centers. He said those were body bags that were, extra materials that they had, and they would push them off the truck, and then the people would come. There'd be a pile of hay, and you stuffed it in, and that was going to be your mattress. My mother suffered a great deal because she was very frail and pregnant. And one of the stories I must tell you is, I have my watch here and I forgot what time I started, but you'll signal me. Okay, 4 more minutes, okay. So at the Assembly Center, it was right in South San Francisco. So there was a chain link fence, and my mother said she could look outside and she could see the buses and the cars going by and people going grocery shopping and walking down the street. And it was particularly painful for her to watch the rest of the world go on. But that a group of Quaker women, American Friends Service Committee, would come every week and stand on the sidewalk there and throw over fresh fruits and vegetables to the prisoners. And one day, one of the women signaled to my mother, I think recognizing that she was pregnant, and had a hand-quilted blanket. And she heaved that over the fence, and she looked at my mother and said, I hope this helps you. So when my mother was ill, and she still had that blanket on her bed. She was 82 years old at the time. And I said, oh, Mom, let's get you a new blanket. You know, nice, fresh, new blanket. And she grabbed it and she said, no. And I asked her why. Why is this so important to you? And she said, this blanket helped me to remember that somebody outside cared. So to me, you represent that contingent of people. And important to really recognize, even though we talk about these horrible things that were done to us, there were good people who stood up for us. There were no massive organizations, there were no marches, there was no tweets on our behalf. And that is one of the things that I think has lasted as a source of fear for the Japanese people, because nobody stood up for us. Individual members of the ACLU did some great work, but so today I think that's why we're organizing ourselves to stand up and stand with people who are being targeted. So an opportunity to educate people from a very personal perspective is really an important thing for me to be a part of. So after 4 months in the Assembly Center, they were transferred to Delta, Utah, to the Topaz War Relocation Authority camp. They called them relocation centers. We call them concentration camps because the Webster's Dictionary says concentration camps. They were not the death camps that the Jews suffered, but they were concentration camps because it held political prisoners based on political outcomes. And at Utah, in 1943, the U.S. government was under a tremendous amount of pressure because 2 things were happening. They were worried that they didn't have enough soldiers fighting in Europe. And the second thing they were worried about was the cost burden for supporting 120,000 people. Started out with 110,000, and then an additional 10,000 births and people that were additionally brought in after the initial removal. So they decided that they would send out this questionnaire. It was called the loyalty questionnaire. And the 2 questions that were crucial, one was, are you willing to bear arms against the enemy anywhere you're deployed? And second, will you forswear loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? And most of the people didn't even know who the Emperor of Japan was. 2/3 of the people who were incarcerated were American citizens. Most never been to Japan. So what they were trying to do was to now justify who they were going to draft out of the prison camps to go fight in Europe, and also who could be released and unburden the government from having to house them and feed them. And so, of course, the general population of the U.S., especially on the West Coast, were still very frightened about how the Japanese Americans had, prior to their incarceration, been accused and portrayed in the press and in the political statements that they were a threat and dangerous. So they figured out, well, we have to find out who's loyal, so we'll ask them. We'll ask them to sign this questionnaire. And if they said yes, yes, that meant they were loyal. If they said no, no, they were labeled as disloyal. And all those that answered no, no were then sent to the Tule Lake Segregation Center, where I was born. So by that time, my parents had had my brother in Utah, and I was born in Tule Lake. They had lost all hope for their well-being in the U.S. Because they had been educated partly in Japan, they decided that they would go back to Japan. And in order to do that, they had to renounce their American citizenship. So they renounced their American citizenship with hopes that they could go back to Japan. And my mother wrote in her diary, I don't want them to be Americans because they have a Japanese face. And in another entry in her diary, she wrote, I wonder if today's the day they're going to line us up and shoot us. So they lived in fear and terror. And because my father stood up at a meeting right after the loyalty questionnaire was distributed and said, we should be treated equal to the free people. And if the government will free us and give us our constitutional rights, we are willing to do anything for America. And they signed this petition, sent it off to Washington, D.C., and they got this very watered down response that didn't address the loyalty issue at all, and that letter was printed in the camp newspaper. And then my parents were very clear that there was no hope for them in the U.S. So because they renounced, they didn't realize this, they would now become enemy aliens. So enemy aliens are the ones that were interned in the DOJ camps, Fort Missoula and Bismarck. My father was sent to Bismarck, North Dakota. And as enemy aliens, they were under the Geneva Convention. So in Bismarck, just like here, they had a swimming pool, they had an ice skating rink, they had a beer garden. In Bismarck, they hung out with the Germans, and my father learned to appreciate classical music as a result of his exposure to the German. Some of them were Nazis that were held there. He didn't like them, but he liked the classical music. So he was separated from us for a year and a half before we were reunited at the Crystal City Family Internment Camp there. And at that time, they were called in and were expecting to be deported to Japan. At the same time, this ACLU attorney named Wayne Collins was outraged by what had happened to the Japanese who had renounced because it was under duress. They were incarcerated, they lost all hope. And so he was fighting with the support of the ACLU to prevent their deportation. In fact, there's stories that he actually was running up on the ramp of the ship that was about to take off, telling people, you don't have to go, you don't have to go. And so he fought for 20 years because they wouldn't accept a class action suit, and Bob could probably tell me the legal ramifications of that. So this Wayne Collins had to, one by one, go through each case to determine that the renunciation was under duress and that they should have their citizenship returned. So my last story is when I was a student at Berkeley during the free speech movement, 1966. See, this is a good group because I talked to some college students the other day and they had no idea what I was talking about. So I was, so all of this was happening at Cal when I was there, and my parents would call me every night and say, okay, look, we do not want to see your name in the newspaper. Do not protest. Bad things will happen to you. You have to go to class. No matter what, you go to class. So I said, okay, good Japanese girl, I'll do what my parents tell me to do. And so I'm walking to class under Sather Gate, going to class, and all the other students are pouring the other way. And I get into the classroom, there's only 3 or 4 of us sitting there. And the professor comes running down right into the classroom, jumps on the desk, and he says, God damn it, if you come to class, I'm going to flunk every single one of you. So I left the classroom not knowing where to go, and I went home to talk to my parents. What is this all about? And she said, we never told you this, but we renounced our citizenship during the war. And bad things happened to us afterwards. And I said, why didn't you tell us? And she said, we're afraid you'd be ashamed of us. When my mother received her check, her $20,000 check, I called her and I said, okay, did the check come? And she said, yes. And I said, okay, well, I want to see it. So I drove down from Sacramento, and she was in San Francisco. And I said, where's the check? I want to see the dough. And she said, oh, it's over there on the desk. And I looked over, the desk was piled with paper. And so I was rifling through the paper, and on the wall was framed the letter from the president with apology. And I said, wow, what does this mean for you? And she said, I feel like I finally got my face back. So there was a lot of shame associated, even though they were innocent of any crime, being incarcerated and segregated from their community and with all the losses they suffered. So as a psychologist, years later, my job has been to work with Japanese American families and their legacy of trauma and how that's manifested today. So I'll stop here. I think I've done it.
I'm just wondering, in your research, in your interviews, how, if people are feeling like they can be forthcoming and talk about it, if you would talk a little bit about that.
You mean in the Japanese American community? I think more than ever. Part of the trauma for us was after the war, we had to figure out how to survive in America that was very hostile towards us. So if you meet people like me, my father was a poet, and so he gave me this beautiful name, Satsuki. But when we were released from camp, the teachers told my parents, if you want your children to be real Americans, they need to have real American names. So my brother Kiyoshi was named Kenny by the school teachers, and I was Sandy for 30 years. So the pressure to assimilate, fit in, we have the highest out-marriage rate of any ethnic group in the U.S. And so the intensity of putting that behind us and suppressing the story was just incredible. So people didn't talk about it, and especially the parents didn't talk about it. Almost everybody I've ever met when I'm interviewing them will say, you know, I don't know much about what my parents went through because they never talked about it. So I think today, after 9/11, was the beginning of people saying, wow, this sounds like what happened to us. So now more and more voices are being heard. People are coming out and speaking. Yeah. So you'll see a bunch of us old gray-haired ladies at the Women's March, showing up at rallies. We have t-shirts that say never again. I'll be wearing that on Tuesday when I show the film at the Roxy Theater. Yes?
Do you find that this presidential term we are in, that it is creating a lot more groups to speak out on behalf of our history? Because many groups' history has been parallel.
Yes.
Many, the Yiddish people, the South American people.
Right, gay, lesbian,
yes,
queer, transgender community, right.
So do you think, since this this term, and that guy is almost saying it's okay for racism, do you think that it's creating more people to become more active, to say, you know, it's a dualistic society. We have many cultures in this country and in this globe.
Right.
You know, we're not just an American society, we're a global society.
And, right. And if ever there was a time, it's now. That these voices be heard and people speak up and we educate each other and we form alliances and coalitions with each other. This is crucial. You want to make a comment?
No, this says it all.
Any more questions?
Mr. Bob, you had that record of that first Japanese fellow in his court case?
Yes.
How did you access that?
Quite by accident. And, it's available online, and I can get that to you, or I can give people my email. And it's a 3-part series called Letters from Camp. And I can't think of the...
Gary Ono.
Yeah, Gary Ono is the author. He lives in Los Angeles. He's actually a docent, I think, at the museum
Cajune,
there.
yeah.
And he's done a documentary film about his father involvement in the war.
It's not a public record.
But this now is online, and it's a 3-part series called Letters from Camp. And I was looking for things that associated. What I'm finding is that my best access to finding information about Justice Department Issei internees is through their families that are otherwise somewhere else. And that was exactly what happened there. He had made a Freedom of Information Act request, I think, in 2008, and got a big box of documents, and he started going through it, and it was called Letters from Camp because I think his family was at Manzanar. In fact, he had a son that was in the Army. He had a son that was killed in a construction accident building barracks at Manzanar. And he had, I think, 7 other children, all ranging down to 10. And there's correspondence about their father and what a travesty this is. But in the process, he put online references to the documents from his internment here. And that's where I found all of these. And I'd be happy to share those sources with anybody. But it's the most complete record that I had seen to that point of the questionnaires and the reports and the recommendations. And in the whole process of, he ultimately appealed the decision. They instituted a policy in the late 43, I think, you could appeal your decision. He appealed the first time, and the standard was you had to provide new evidence. Well, the problem was they never knew what the evidence was against them. But to get an overturned verdict, they had to provide new evidence. So the first time around, they said, well, there's no new evidence. But there were more pressures. There was a Catholic organization that got involved, and ultimately he was released to join the family at Manzanar. But it was 2 years after he left here before that happened, and that was a rare circumstance. But I'd be happy, and I can't think of the name of that source, that online source of Japanese documents.
Densho? Oh, yeah, Densho.
Densho, it's Densho. Look on Densho, and you look under Letters from Camp 1 through 3, Gary Ono, O-N-O. He's the grandson of Okamura.
So you have family affiliation in camp. Where did your family members go?
They were in Rower.
In Arkansas?
Yeah, in Arkansas, and my father's side as well. Yeah.
Anyone else have affiliation with camp?
And they were both my mom and dad, they weren't, together, but they were in Chicago. Yeah.
When they were incarcerated?
Afterwards. They were allowed to leave in late 40s.
I see.
And they went to Chicago.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people did.
A lot of people did, because when people were being released, they were encouraged not to go back to the West Coast because there was still lots of animosity, and you wouldn't be able to get a job or rent a house to live in.
Yeah, and the older folks all stayed in camp. The kids got the heck out of there, but I think most of the older folks stayed in camp. So.
One more question, I guess, if there is one.
It's a lot like slavery. They said, okay, Emancipation Proclamation, you're free to go. Many of the elders who were incarcerated had no place to go. They had lost their land, they had lost their jobs, they didn't have the education that they had planned on. So for them, they wanted to stay in the camp as long as possible. After the camps were starting to be closed, there were several suicides of elderly Japanese men that didn't have families. They hung themselves because they had nothing.
I've been to Rower, and the one thing that's really there is the cemetery. And you have to understand, there are lots of these old men who were widows or were never married.
Or never married.
Never married.
Yeah.
And they're in their 80s and 70s when they took them to Arkansas. So they died there in camp, yeah.
And one of the things we didn't say is that anti-miscegenation law was enacted so that these bachelors, young men that came over to work as laborers, weren't allowed to marry white women. And so many of them ended up lifelong bachelors. Yeah.
Bob, especially the three-panel judge, you said that Mansfield was one of those judges, is that?
He was one of the Montana people designated to be a judge. There were probably half a dozen. The fellow that had the Ford dealership here in town, H.O. Bell, was on there. E.C. Mulroney, but they were really fill-ins. Mansfield denied that he ever had any real involvement with it. He was asked that question, I believe, when he was, at the time he was ambassador to Japan. And, who knows, He's a revered figure in this state, and I guess, he didn't want to respond, but they were supposed to be people from your community so that you had some ability to relate to this person and what they were doing, et cetera, et cetera. We know as a result of Mr. Okamura that they had one from San Francisco and the U.S. attorney from Great Falls, former, who was notorious for taking care of the bad, what he called the bad Japs. And it had to be paroled, it required unanimity. All the judges had to agree to let you go. And you were not told, and it was a recommendation to DOJ, and they could overrule it. But if you weren't unanimously recommended for parole, you didn't get it.
So none of these individuals ever recant or basically said, we're sorry, we made a mistake. You're in there.
No. And the other important thing I want to point out is none of these people that was arrested in Hawaii or on the West Coast, 2,500 men, was ever charged with any impropriety, no crimes, no allegations, never. And it was a truly ghastly, unfortunate situation. Yes.
How did they get to the loyalty part? What kind of questions did they ask? And were they just off the cuff, or were they given a set of questions?
No, I think that they were given some questions, but it was largely guilt by association. And so if you belong to the Japanese Chamber of Commerce, and of course that would not be unusual if you were Japanese and you weren't encouraged to be a Rotarian or anything, although Masayu Usui was, then they would explore, what ties did you have with Japan because of that? If you'd been in the Japanese military, and some of these men had way back when, one of the things that Seiichi Okamura did was he made a donation to a fund for commemorating an admiral from the Russian-Japanese War. And they held that against him, notwithstanding that the United States sent a carrier to Yokohama Bay when they had a celebration there for the same admiral. It was really, you were really guilty. As if there was a charge, you were guilty, and the more prominent you were, the more likely they would have some tie, the more likely when you filled out this questionnaire that they would just supplement that. And it was just an impossible situation.
So, and I want to just add that when I did the research on my father and got his FBI file, there was a handwritten report because they were investigating leaders in the San Francisco area prior to the breakout of the war. And on this handwritten note by somebody who had been following or watching what was going on in the Japanese community, and it said that Itaru Ina attended the Buddhist church, and during that service they all spoke Japanese, and there was no American flag. There's no American flag. And that's the only hard piece of evidence that the FBI had against my father.
Yes.
After you got out of Thule, and you and your mother, you as an infant, you got out before your father did. What was your life like after that?
Well, what happened was, because my mother was on the, what they call the stop list, anybody who renounced their citizenship, they were, as the camps were closing, because it had been determined that the war was over and now they were going to release everybody. So she was held at Tule Lake, and I had my brother and me and my mother while my father was in Bismarck. And they were closing Bismarck. So they sent him to Santa Fe, and then sent us all to meet at Crystal City. Crystal City was a DOJ camp. It was a family camp. They called it the Family Reunification Camp. And that's where we were reunited with my father. Life afterwards for many people, you know, I interviewed hundreds of people when I was working on my project, said that life after camp was even worse. Because post-war hostility was still very high. People had lost their husbands and fathers and brothers, and so that Japanese face was still a source of great pain and hostility. So many of us couldn't go back to the West Coast because you couldn't get a job and you wouldn't be allowed to have any housing. People wouldn't rent homes to you. So we came to Cincinnati. We went to Cincinnati. The American Friends Service Committee set up these hospitality centers at certain places in the Midwest to welcome and help you find housing. And my father had a relative that also helped us make the adjustment. But eventually we went back to San Francisco. And you know, it was a struggle. They lost everything, so they were starting from scratch and had to rely on each other to find work because they wouldn't hire my father or my mother to do any work. So gradually they, you know, they reestablished themselves. We lived in the ghetto, and you know, by the time I started elementary school, my teeth were all rotten because we didn't have any dental care from the period of time that we had our baby teeth coming in. So there were a lot of health problems. There were, you know, it was a collective historic trauma. So everybody had been traumatized, and seeking safety and some sense of security led to long-term kinds of effects. That we didn't create a problem for society. Our, you know, crime rate and even mental health problems never showed up statistically, but we suppressed a lot. Yeah, there was a lot still going on.
And the same thing happened with the Issei, and I'll just take two quick examples. One, if you watch the DVD with Masui Yasui, he had $500,000 of orchard property, stump land that he had pulled the stumps, and he became, you know, a director of the Apple Growers Society and or Association in Hood River. They lost all of that, and he was not welcome back. There's a Dr. Benjamin Tanaka that was here, was released 4 months after the end of the war. He was not welcome back in Portland, although he had had a marvelous clientele beforehand. And then Hawaii is an even worse situation for the Issei, because the only people that were interned or imprisoned in Hawaii were the Issei. 40% of the population of Hawaii had Japanese ancestry. It was determined that to imprison them, they didn't treat them the same way they did the 120,000. They declared martial law and said, you will continue to live in your homes, you will continue to work, because if we do otherwise, the economy will fail. So the only people that ended up in jail, so to speak, from Hawaii were the Issei. So when they went back, they really had a tough time because they were the only ones that had been imprisoned.
So in terms of all this, is there any thought that there was some, with all these government edicts and stuff, that there was some possible kind of crappy incentive to, because they took everything from these people, and when people came back, they had nothing from all the built-up businesses. Was there any kind of thought that that was also ulterior motive of all these government internments? Just out of curiosity.
Well, yes, there was very organized effort to put pressure on politicians and to take steps to get rid of the Japanese off the West Coast. The fishing industry and the farming industry were the two areas that the Japanese had outbid, they came, the immigrants had come from Japan from an island where they developed farming strategies for high density areas. And so they were only allowed to lease land in these areas that was considered infertile, and they made it. And both the fishing industry, same thing with the fishing industry, Japanese fishing technique and method designed specifically outstripped the success of the others. So this happened in Canada too, the Japanese Canadians on the West Coast. I want to just add one thing, because you asked about the Peruvians that were kidnapped from Peru and other South American countries too, but primarily Peru. And the reason that the government made that negotiation is because they were afraid they weren't going to have enough bodies for a prisoner of war exchange. And so they negotiated to have the Japanese Peruvians, who were storekeepers, businessmen, leaders, and could bring them. And so they showed up in the DOJ camps, particularly in Crystal City too. And the plan was that when the Americans that had been captured by the Japanese were going to be brought back in exchange for the Japanese Peruvians. The Japanese didn't want the Peruvians.
Yeah.
They didn't speak Japanese, they spoke Spanish.
Wow.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. Just a couple quick last things. If you ever want to come back and spend more time at the barracks, anytime the museum outbuildings are open, the barracks are open. There's also an exhibit inside the main museum building. So that is right now 12 to 5, Tuesday through Sunday, so just not Mondays. And that'll be open through October, the end of October. Then we shut down for the winter, so if you want to see it through the winter, just call me or email me at the fort. You can find my info on the website. I'm happy to do personal tours, or if you have a group of people that you want to bring back. Or if you're really interested and you want to be a tour guide, you let me know too. Don't forget to finish your evaluations, and they're being collected at the door. I also have DVDs and copies of the exhibit text and a couple books that I'll be selling at the little check-in station. And so other than that, we have big plans for this building, so keep watching us on Facebook and come to more presentations. So thank you for coming.